Before the first stars ever twinkled above the vast expanse of the Grand Canyon, the land below held secrets. Whispered stories passed from generation to generation. To the Cherokee, this land was sacred, a place of both breathtaking beauty and unimaginable danger. Beneath the towering cliffs and within the deep shadowed crevices, ancient spirits roamed, forever tied to the earth. These are the stories that echo through time, tales of the cursed, the lost, and the forgotten, tales that still send chills down the spines of those who dare to listen. Come, gather close, for the Cherokee do not speak lightly of these horrors. The spirits of the canyon are restless, and tonight their stories will be told. Story 1: The Spirit of the Canyon's Edge. For as long as anyone could remember, the Cherokee people spoke in hushed tones about the Grand Canyon, that great gash in the earth that seemed to touch the sky and reach into the depths of the underworld. It was not only revered for its beauty, but feared for the spirits that resided there, most notably the spirit that haunted the canyon's edge. This tale is about a young Cherokee warrior named Nahili, who had long prided himself on his bravery. He had faced wild beasts, rival warriors, and the harsh wilderness, yet he had never encountered anything that truly unsettled him, until the day he ventured too close to the edge of the Grand Canyon. Nahili had heard the stories of the cursed woman who wandered the cliffs, but like many young men, he dismissed it as nothing more than an old wives' tale, designed to keep children in line. He believed himself immune to the powers of fear. However, when he stood on the precipice of the Grand Canyon, looking out over the seemingly endless void, something stirred deep within him, a primal feeling of unease. The wind seemed to carry voices, faint at first, whispering words he couldn't understand. Nahili shook his head and dismissed it as a trick of the wind. As he prepared to leave, the voice grew clearer, and to his shock it was no longer strange or distant. It was his mother's voice, calling his name, begging for help. Nahili turned quickly, his eyes scanning the canyon's edge, his heart pounding. His mother had died many years ago, but the voice was unmistakable. Desperation took hold of him as he strained his eyes, seeing nothing but the desolate landscape stretching out around him. He backed away from the cliff, but the voice persisted, growing louder, more insistent. It echoed off the canyon walls, growing in clarity. "Nahili, help me. Please." His mother's voice was filled with pain and sorrow. Against his better judgment, he stepped closer to the edge, leaning forward to peer over the rim. That was when he saw her. Far below, standing on a narrow ledge, was the figure of a woman, her arms outstretched. The woman's face was obscured, but her long, dark hair billowed in the wind, and she wore a tattered white dress. She stood precariously on the very edge of the ledge, swaying as if she might fall at any moment. Nahili's heart skipped a beat, torn between his fear and the instinct to save whoever this was. Could it truly be his mother's spirit, trapped in the canyon, waiting for him to rescue her? But as he took a step closer, his mind clouded with doubt. Something was wrong. His mother's spirit wouldn't be here. The tales came rushing back to him, the warnings from the elders. The canyon was home to a restless spirit, a woman who had been cast into the abyss by her tribe long ago, a punishment for breaking the sacred laws. She had died in agony, and her spirit remained tethered to the canyon, forever seeking company in her eternal torment. Realization hit him like a cold wind. This was no ordinary woman, no benign spirit. This was the one the Cherokee elders spoke of, the spirit of the canyon's edge. She lured people to their deaths, mimicking the voices of their loved ones, using their memories and emotions against them. Nahili staggered back, trying to clear his head, but the voice grew louder, more insistent, and it was no longer just his mother's. Now he heard the voices of friends, of loved ones, all calling to him from the abyss. "Nahili, don't leave me," the voices pleaded, each one pulling at his heartstrings, each one tempting him to take that final step. His legs trembled as he fought against the pull of the spirit. The figure below stretched her arms wider, beckoning him with ghostly grace. Her face, still hidden, seemed to smile beneath the shadow of her hair. Then, with a horrifying shriek, the wind shifted and her voice changed. It became dark and guttural, No longer the sweet call of his mother, but something far more sinister. "Come to me," it commanded. "Join me." Nahali's heart raced as the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. He turned to run, but the world tilted, the cliffside suddenly feeling unstable, as if the canyon itself wanted to swallow him whole. His mind spun with terror. Was it real, or was this all an illusion crafted by the spirit to trap him? With all his strength, Nahali pulled himself away from the edge, running back into the safety of the forest. The wind howled behind him, the voice shrieking in anger as he escaped. When he reached the safety of his village, he collapsed, breathless and shaken. The elders found him the next day, muttering of spirits and curses. They knew what had happened, for they had warned him, as they had warned others before him. He had been marked by the spirit of the canyon's edge. From that day on, Nahali never returned to the Grand Canyon, and his once brave heart was forever haunted by the whispers of the wind, always calling his name. Story 2. The Cursed Waters of the Colorado River. The Colorado River, the lifeblood that carved the mighty Grand Canyon, was revered by many native tribes, but the Cherokee held a darker view of its waters. There were whispers of an ancient curse, one tied to betrayal and vengeance, a curse that transformed the river from a source of sustenance into a deadly trap for those who dared disrespect it. This story begins with a group of Cherokee hunters who set out on an expedition to gather food for their people during a time of drought. Led by a man named Talaco, a skilled hunter with a reputation for bravery, the group ventured farther than they ever had before. As they approached the banks of the Colorado River, they marveled at its majesty, its clear waters a stark contrast to the dry lands they had left behind. But the river's beauty hid a terrible secret. That night, as the hunters made camp near the river, they heard strange sounds coming from the water, a low murmur like distant voices. At first, they paid it no mind, believing it to be the sound of the current or perhaps some distant wildlife. However, as the night deepened, the voices grew louder. Talaco, curious and unafraid, approached the riverbank alone, wanting to investigate. Standing at the edge of the water, Talaco looked down into the river's depths. The moonlight reflected off the surface, but beneath it, he could see something moving, dark shapes swirling just beneath the water. Then, as if rising from the depths of his memory, he remembered the legend of the cursed waters. The river had been blessed and cursed by an ancient medicine man from their tribe, a man who had been wronged by his own people. The story was one of betrayal. The medicine man had been a trusted elder, a man of great power and wisdom, but when he foresaw a tragedy that would befall his village, his warnings were ignored. The people, fearing his visions, branded him a liar and an outcast. In his sorrow, the medicine man cursed the river, swearing that it would never bring peace or life to those who had turned against him. He walked into the river's depths, never to return, and from that moment the waters claimed lives instead of nourishing them. Talaco's blood ran cold as the memory of the tale resurfaced, but before he could retreat, a hand shot up from the water. It was pale and ghostly, gripping his ankle with icy strength. He screamed, trying to pull away, but the hand held firm, dragging him closer to the river's edge. His fellow hunters, hearing his cries, rushed to his aid. But as they reached him, they saw the impossible. More hands, pale and translucent, reaching out from the water, pulling Talaco into the river. His men grabbed hold of him, trying to pull him back, but the force from the river was too strong. The more they pulled, the deeper the hands dragged him into the water. It was as if the river itself was alive, hungry for souls. The men watched in horror as the water swirled around them, the once calm surface now a churning vortex. Dark shapes moved beneath the surface, and for a brief moment, they saw faces, twisted and tormented, of those who had been claimed by the curse. Talaco's screams grew fainter as the water rose over his head. In moments he was gone, swallowed by the river, leaving nothing but a faint ripple behind. The remaining hunters, shaken and terrified, fled from the river's edge. As they ran, they could still hear the whispers from the water, voices calling to them, beckoning them back to join their fallen leader, but none dared look back. When the survivors returned to their village, they told the elders of what had happened, of how Talaco had been claimed by the cursed waters. The elders nodded solemnly, for they too had heard the legend. They warned the hunters never to return to the Colorado River, for the curse would claim more lives if it was disrespected. Those who ventured too close to the water would be pulled under, joining the countless souls trapped beneath its surface, forever part of the river's dark, swirling depths. From that day on, the Cherokee knew that the Colorado River was not to be trusted. Its waters may appear calm and inviting, but beneath the surface, a curse as old as time itself waited, watching, ready to pull the unwary into its cold embrace. Story 3. The Skinwalkers of the Canyon Shadows. Heart-pounding, Ajuanita's breath came in shallow gasps as she crouched low behind a boulder, her pulse echoing in her ears. She could hear the faint rustle of movement just beyond her hiding place, the sound of something, no someone, pacing in the shadows of the canyon. The night was eerily quiet, with only the soft murmur of wind through the jagged rocks and the distant cry of a lone coyote. But Ajuanita knew she wasn't alone. The warnings had been clear. Her elders had spoken of this place, where the canyon's deep crevices and sheer cliffs concealed more than just rock and earth. They had told stories of the skinwalkers, evil beings who could take the form of animals stalking the unwary under the cover of darkness. These shapeshifters were not mere folklore. They were feared, whispered about in reverence and terror, beings who had traded their humanity for dark magic. But Ajuanita, like many of the younger Cherokee, had not believed. She had ventured out into the canyon with her brother Waya and their 2 friends, confident in their ability to navigate the land. They had grown up in these forests, familiar with the lay of the land, and the stories had seemed like just that, stories. Now, as the shadows lengthened and the canyon seemed to come alive with unnatural sounds, Ajuanita regretted not heeding the warnings. It had begun earlier in the evening as they set up camp near the base of the canyon. Waya had been the first to notice something strange. A wolf, standing motionless at the edge of their campsite, watching them. At first they had been wary but not overly concerned. Wolves were not uncommon in the area, though it was unusual for one to stand so still, so intently focused on them. The animal's eyes glowed a deep, unnatural yellow in the fading light, and its body seemed almost too still, like a statue frozen in place. Waya had whispered for everyone to stay calm, but as the wolf remained rooted to the spot, its gaze unblinking, an unease crept over the group. Ajuanita had felt a chill crawl up her spine, but when the wolf finally slunk back into the shadows, they had shaken it off as nothing more than an eerie encounter. That had been their mistake. As night descended fully, strange things began to happen. They heard soft footfalls around their camp, but every time they looked, there was nothing there. The fire they had built flickered wildly, as though something unseen was moving just beyond its light, and then, without warning, Waya had vanished. One moment he had been standing beside her, talking softly as they ate their meal by the fire. The next he was gone. No sound, no sign of struggle, just gone as if the earth itself had swallowed him. Ajuanita had cried out, and the others had scrambled to search for him, calling his name into the canyon's vast darkness. But there had been no answer. Now hiding behind the boulder, her breath shallow with fear, Ajuanita couldn't shake the feeling that she was being hunted. The sound of movement grew closer, and she dared to peek over the edge of the rock. What she saw made her blood run cold. There, standing just beyond the circle of moonlight, was Waya, or at least it looked like Waya. He stood unnaturally still, his eyes fixed on her, but something was wrong. His face was pale, his skin stretched too tightly over his bones, and his eyes, they weren't Waya's eyes. They were the eyes of the wolf, glowing with the same unnatural yellow light she had seen earlier. "Ajuanita," he called, his voice soft but hollow, devoid of emotion. "Come with me. I found the way out." Her heart pounded harder, the weight of the fear pressing down on her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move, frozen by the sight of her brother, or the thing that wore his face. She had heard the stories of skinwalkers, how they could take on the form of both animals and people, mimicking voices, appearances, even memories. But seeing it for herself was something else entirely. The figure stepped closer, but its movements were all wrong, stiff, jerky, as though it wasn't used to walking on 2 legs. Ajuanita swallowed hard, her mind racing. This wasn't her brother. It was something else, something dark, wearing his skin like a mask. The real Waya was still out there, she told herself. He had to be. The thing that looked like Waya tilted its head slightly, its eyes narrowing as if it could sense her hesitation. "It's not safe here," it said, the voice a mockery of her brother's warmth. "Come with me now." Awanita felt her legs trembling beneath her. She had to move, had to get away, but the thing was blocking her path. She took a deep breath, trying to gather her courage, and then, from the darkness, she heard a sound, a low growl, guttural and threatening. The thing that was pretending to be Waya whipped its head toward the sound, its eyes narrowing into slits. From the shadows emerged a figure, a wolf, but not just any wolf. This one was massive, larger than any Awanita had ever seen, its fur black as night and its eyes glowing with a deep blood-red light. The wolf stood between her and the creature, growling menacingly, its fangs bared. For a moment everything was still. Then with a snarl, the creature wearing Waya's face lunged at the wolf. The two collided with a force that sent them tumbling into the darkness, their growls and snarls echoing off the canyon walls. Awanita didn't wait to see the outcome. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her feet slipping on the loose rocks as she fled deeper into the canyon. Her mind raced, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear, but she couldn't stop. The wind howled around her, and she could still hear the distant sounds of the struggle behind her. Growls, snarls, and the sickening thud of bodies colliding. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out beneath her. Collapsing to the ground, she gasped for breath, her heart racing. She had no idea where she was or how far she had come, but she couldn't stop now. She had to find Waya, the real Waya, before it was too late. The night grew colder and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, twisting and writhing like living things. Awanita huddled against a rock, her body trembling from both the cold and the terror that gripped her. The stories had always been vague about how to fight a skinwalker, but one thing was certain: they could not be killed by ordinary means. Suddenly, a soft rustle came from behind her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly she turned, her heart pounding in her chest. There, just beyond the edge of the firelight, stood Waya, or what she hoped was Waya. He looked battered, his clothes torn and his face scratched, but his eyes were his own. There was no yellow glow, no unnatural stillness. "Awanita," he said, his voice shaky but familiar. "It's me." She hesitated, the fear still clinging to her, but deep down, she knew. She could feel it in her bones. This was her brother. She rushed to him, throwing her arms around him, and for a moment they just held each other, the terror of the night finally catching up to them. "We have to leave," Waya whispered, "now before it comes back." Without another word, they turned and ran, the canyon's shadows still watching, still waiting. They knew they weren't safe yet, but together they stood a chance against the horrors lurking in the canyon's darkness. Story 4. The Ghost Warriors of the Red Rocks. Long before the settlers came, long before the paths of the Grand Canyon were worn smooth by the feet of explorers and tourists, there was a battle. A brutal, bloody clash between rival tribes, one of which was a faction of Cherokee warriors who had traveled far from their ancestral lands. They had come to defend the sacred canyon from an invading tribe that sought to claim the land's power for themselves. This battle was spoken of in whispered tones by Cherokee elders who warned that the spirits of the fallen warriors had never left the canyon. They lingered, restless, bound to the land by their violent deaths. It was said that the canyon's red rocks were stained with the blood of those warriors, and on nights when the moon was full, the ghosts of the battle would rise again, reliving their final moments, their cries of agony and fury echoing through the canyon walls. For generations, these stories had kept many from venturing too far into the depths of the canyon after dark. But for a group of modern-day explorers, the tales of ghost warriors seemed nothing more than superstition until they ventured too deep. Marcus, a seasoned hiker and amateur archaeologist, had always been fascinated by the legends surrounding the Grand Canyon. He had heard the tales from a Cherokee elder during a visit to a reservation years earlier. Intrigued by the idea of ancient battles and the possibility of discovering artifacts left behind, he convinced 3 of his friends to join him on a journey into the canyon. They planned to camp for several nights, exploring parts of the canyon that were less frequented by tourists. His friends, Sarah, Jake, and Natalie, were equally excited about the adventure, though they treated the ghost stories with the same casual disbelief Marcus had, until the first night they set up camp. The red rocks of the canyon loomed high above them, casting long, ominous shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. As they gathered around the fire, the wind picked up, whistling through the canyon with a haunting, hollow sound. Sarah was the first to mention the unease that settled over them. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" she asked, her voice low, as though she didn't want to disturb the stillness around them. Jake laughed nervously. "Come on, it's just the stories getting to you. We're in one of the most isolated parts of the canyon. There's no one out here." But even as he said it, Jake couldn't help but glance over his shoulder into the deepening darkness, as though expecting to see something lurking just beyond the firelight. As night fell, the wind seemed to carry whispers, faint but unmistakable. Marcus brushed it off as the wind playing tricks with the canyon's acoustics, but there was something unsettling about the way the whispers seemed to circle them, as if they were being spoken directly into their ears. By the time they settled into their tents, a tense silence had settled over the group. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the rocky walls around them. Natalie lay awake, her eyes wide, listening to the wind, trying to convince herself that it was nothing more than her imagination. Hours passed in uneasy sleep until sometime after midnight, Sarah woke to a sound that sent a chill down her spine. It was a distant drumbeat, faint but rhythmic, like the pounding of war drums echoing off the canyon walls. She sat up in her tent, straining to listen. The drums grew louder, joined by a sound that froze her blood. Battle cries. She scrambled out of her tent, her heart racing, and found Marcus already awake, standing at the edge of their camp, staring into the darkness. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded, but said nothing. The sounds of battle were unmistakable now, the clash of weapons, the guttural shouts of warriors, the thunder of hooves. But there was no one there. The canyon, bathed in the eerie light of the full moon, appeared deserted, yet the sounds surrounded them, growing louder with each passing moment. Natalie and Jake emerged from their tents, their faces drawn with fear. None of them could explain what they were hearing, but none of them could deny it either. The drums pounded in the night, a relentless rhythmic beat that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. The air grew thick with the smell of smoke and blood, though there was no fire, no sign of any living soul. Marcus, compelled by both curiosity and fear, grabbed his flashlight and began to walk toward the source of the sound, his friends close behind. The canyon seemed to pulse with the energy of the long-ago battle, the invisible warriors locked in an eternal fight for their lives. As they neared the base of a steep cliff, they saw them. At first, it was hard to tell whether what they were seeing was real or a trick of the moonlight. The figures appeared like shadows, their forms barely solid, but as they watched in horror, the ghostly warriors became more distinct. Men on horseback, their faces painted for battle, their weapons raised, charged across the canyon floor, locked in combat with an unseen enemy. The air was filled with their cries of fury and pain, but what struck Marcus most was the fact that every one of the ghostly warriors was headless. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. These were the spirits of the Cherokee warriors, the ones who had fallen in the ancient battle. Their heads had been taken by their enemies as trophies, leaving their spirits incomplete, trapped in the cycle of violence, unable to move on. Suddenly, one of the ghost warriors turned toward them as if sensing their presence. Though it had no head, its body moved with terrifying purpose, and the air around it seemed to hum with dark energy. The figure raised its weapon, a tomahawk, and began to move toward them, its ghostly form flickering in and out of existence as it approached. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as the others backed away in terror. The ghostly warrior picked up speed, its weapon glinting in the moonlight as it raised the tomahawk high, preparing to strike. "Run!" Marcus shouted, snapping out of his shock. They all turned and fled, their footsteps echoing off the canyon walls as they raced back toward their camp. Behind them, they could hear the pounding of hooves, the war cries of the headless warriors growing louder, as if the entire ghostly army had now turned its attention on them. The campsite came into view, but Marcus knew that they couldn't stay there. They had to leave the canyon, to escape whatever curse they had unwittingly triggered by venturing too close to the ancient battlefield. They grabbed what little gear they could, not stopping to pack, not stopping to think. As they ran through the narrow canyon paths, the sounds of battle followed them. Hoofbeats, the clash of weapons, the cries of the dead. The wind howled, carrying with it the tortured voices of the fallen warriors, forever locked in their ghostly struggle. It wasn't until the first light of dawn touched the horizon that the sounds began to fade. The hoofbeats slowed, then disappeared altogether, leaving only the distant whisper of the wind. Exhausted and terrified, Marcus and his friends collapsed at the canyon's edge, the haunting cries of the ghost warriors still echoing in their ears. They had survived the night, but they knew they had seen something no living person was meant to witness. The battle between the ghost warriors would rage on, forever replaying beneath the red rocks of the Grand Canyon, and those who ventured too close would always be in danger of being caught in the eternal struggle. Story 5. The Cave of Eternal Darkness. The Cherokee had always known there were places in the world best left undisturbed, places where the veil between the living and the dead was thin, where ancient spirits still roamed, and where darkness itself seemed to have a mind and hunger of its own. Of all the legends that circled through Cherokee folklore, none were more feared than the story of the cave deep within the Grand Canyon, a place that elders called the Cave of Eternal Darkness. It was said to be a gateway to the underworld, a place where the souls of the dead lingered, waiting to claim anyone foolish enough to enter. For centuries, the Cherokee avoided the cave, warning their children never to venture near it. Even those with the strongest spiritual powers dared not step into its shadow. But as time passed, and the modern world encroached on ancient lands, the stories began to fade into myth. Fewer people remembered the warnings, and even fewer believed them. A modern-day adventurer named Caleb, driven by his passion for discovering hidden places, was one such skeptic. He had heard about the Cave of Eternal Darkness from a Cherokee elder during one of his explorations through the region. The elder had warned him in no uncertain terms that the cave was not like any other place in the Grand Canyon. Caleb had listened politely but was not deterred. To him, it was just another story, a remnant of a past filled with superstition and fear. His curiosity had always been stronger than any warnings, and he was determined to find this cave that had terrified generations. It took weeks of research and several trips into the more remote parts of the canyon, but eventually, Caleb found what he believed to be the entrance to the fabled cave. It was hidden behind a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, almost invisible from any angle except one. As he stood before it, peering into the dark void, he felt a chill run down his spine, an unshakable sense that he was standing on the threshold of something ancient and malevolent. But he brushed the feeling aside. He was an adventurer after all. Fear was just another obstacle to overcome. The cave was larger than he had expected. As he stepped inside, the air became noticeably colder, and the world outside seemed to vanish. His flashlight beam flickered across the smooth stone walls, but the darkness seemed to swallow the light, making the cave feel more oppressive with each step. The deeper he went, the more the sense of unease grew, as though the very walls were watching him, waiting. Caleb continued onward, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the enclosed space. There was no sound other than the soft crunch of his boots on the gravelly floor, no wind, no distant animal calls, just an eerie, pervasive silence that made his skin crawl. After a while, he noticed strange markings on the walls. They were old, ancient even, carved deep into the rock, but he couldn't make out their meaning. The symbols seemed to shift in the dim light, twisting and warping as he tried to focus on them, as though they were alive. Suddenly, the beam from his flashlight dimmed, flickering erratically. He tapped it, his heart quickening as the darkness pressed in around him. Finally, the light steadied, but in that brief moment of darkness, Caleb swore he had seen something, a figure, tall and shadowy, standing just beyond the edge of the light. He whipped the flashlight around, shining it into the blackness, but there was nothing there, just the empty cave. The silence was broken by a faint whisper, At first, Caleb thought it was just the sound of air moving through the cave, but then it came again, clearer this time. A low, guttural voice speaking in a language he didn't understand. His pulse quickened, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The whisper was coming from deeper within the cave, pulling him further in. Against his better judgment, Caleb moved toward the sound, feeling an almost magnetic pull, like something was calling him. As he ventured deeper, the light from his flashlight began to fade again, this time more gradually. The cave walls seemed to close in, the air thickening with a tangible sense of dread. Then the whispers grew louder, more insistent, surrounding him. They weren't coming from one direction anymore. They were all around him, echoing off the walls, filling his ears, his mind. Caleb stopped in his tracks, suddenly realizing that he had no idea how far he had come or how to get back. Panic clawed at his chest. He spun in circles, shining his dimming flashlight in every direction, but the cave had transformed around him. The entrance was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The once familiar path had disappeared, replaced by twisting, narrow passageways that seemed to lead deeper and deeper into the earth. The whispers became voices now, clear and sharp, overlapping one another, each one pulling him in a different direction. They were voices of the dead. He could feel it. Caleb's heart raced as he tried to block them out, but they pierced through his thoughts, calling him by name. Caleb. Caleb. He stumbled backward, his mind racing. How did they know his name? He hadn't spoken since entering the cave, and no one else was supposed to be here. The darkness pressed in closer, the air growing colder with each step. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move. A figure, pale and ghostly, appeared at the edge of the flashlight's failing beam. It was the figure of a man, his face twisted in agony, his eyes hollow and black. He reached out toward Caleb, his mouth moving in silent pleas. Caleb froze, unable to tear his eyes away from the apparition. The man was dressed in ancient clothing, his body covered in blood, his limbs broken and contorted in unnatural angles. He was a warrior, one of the fallen souls trapped in the cave. Caleb's mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The figure came closer, its lifeless eyes locked onto his. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, replaced by another, and then another. Dozens of ghostly figures began to materialize around him, each one more twisted and grotesque than the last. Their faces contorted in pain, their mouths open in soundless cries. They reached for him, their fingers like claws, their touch icy and deathly cold. He turned and ran, the flashlight barely illuminating the way as he stumbled through the narrow passages, the whispers following him, growing louder, more urgent. The ground seemed to shift beneath him, the walls closing in as though the cave itself were alive, pulling him deeper into its grasp. Then the floor gave way. Caleb fell, tumbling down a steep slope of jagged rocks, his flashlight flying from his hand and smashing against the stone, plunging him into complete darkness. He landed hard, the wind knocked from his lungs. Gasping for breath, he struggled to his feet, his body aching from the fall. But the darkness was absolute now. There was no light, no sense of direction, only the suffocating blackness and the relentless whispers that now echoed inside his mind. In the distance, a faint light flickered. Desperate, Caleb staggered toward it, his legs weak, his body trembling with fear. As he neared the light, he saw that it wasn't the exit. It wasn't salvation. It was a figure shrouded in shadow, holding a dim, flickering lantern. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its body covered in tattered robes. It had no face, only a dark void where its features should have been, and in its hand, it held an ancient staff, the tip of which glowed with the faint light. The whispers grew louder as Caleb approached, and the figure began to move, slowly and deliberately, deeper into the cave. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as he followed, unable to stop himself. The figure led him through narrow tunnels and vast chambers, each one more nightmarish than the last. He saw visions, horrors beyond imagining. The walls of the cave seemed to pulse with life, twisted faces pressing out from the stone, their mouths open in silent screams. The floor was littered with bones, ancient and fresh, the remains of those who had come before him. The figure stopped before a large, yawning chasm, its depths impossible to see. The whispers reached a fever pitch, deafening in their intensity. Caleb stood at the edge, staring into the abyss, his body trembling. The figure turned toward him, its empty gaze locking onto his. "Join us," it whispered, its voice like the wind through dead trees. "There is no escape." Caleb felt his body move toward the edge, his feet inching closer to the void. The darkness below seemed to call to him, promising release. An end to the terror. His mind screamed in protest, but his body was no longer his own. He teetered on the brink, the cold air from the chasm rising up to greet him. In the last moment before he fell, a single clear thought pierced the fog of his mind. The stories were true. And then Caleb plunged into the abyss, swallowed by the eternal darkness of the cave, his screams lost to the whispers of the dead.